Hello and welcome to the ninth edition of Dean and Ben Talk Tech, a podcast between two analysts on telecoms, policy, broadband and related topics. How are you
Hi,
doing,
Dean.
Benoit?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. We're past the high heats, so it's quite pleasant here in France today.
Yeah, back to normal in London as well, at least for now. So,
But you
yeah,
haven't been in London much, though, have you?
No, I'd say the last month or so since we recorded the last podcast, I've been to North America. I can't remember if it was like two or three times. I went to ConnectX in Florida, which was sort of infrastructure and towers and small cells. Canadian Telecom Summit in Toronto, Spectrum an AI thing in Washington, and then a couple of other things on AI and voice. Vendor specific things. I went to a moderated thing for Amdocs in Madrid and Netaxis I spoke at in Italy on Telecom Sovereignty. Come back to that in a second. And I was at the Cloud Communications Alliance last week in Amsterdam. And a real key theme that's come out of all of this is sovereignty. And I know we can also talk about what the European Commission announced last week with its sovereignty package. And there's a couple of things that I'm seeing. One is that operators are looking at the opportunities from this requirement for sovereignty and what that means in different geographies, aligning with policy and regulatory trends. And there's different ones in Europe and in Canada and the UK. And that really drives down to a potential to offer sovereign infrastructure services. Like you've got companies like TELUS in Canada and BT building data centers. There's a lot of interest in localized AI factories, either for government or academia to get access to secure sovereign resources. And then there's point services like unified comms and voice and video conferencing. But there's a second side of it that I suddenly realized last week, looking at some of the European Cloud and AI Development Act details, particularly relating to public procurement of cloud services in Europe. And essentially, what is happening is that not just in telecoms, but generally, there's a big push to classifying cloud services based on four-tier model for sovereignty, and that's going into the procurement rules, particularly for public sector organizations. And there's sort of differing levels of sovereignness. How much is run in Europe, how much is owned by Europe, how much is deployed and operated by European citizens, and whether data can be used extraterritorially or not. And I mean, a lot of this is driven by concerns about EU sovereignty on hyperscale versus hyperscalers and cloud and AI models, and there's a parallel stream around chips as well. But I think that some of the telecoms operators may get caught in the crossfire here, especially if they're offering services to government. Because even the lowest tier of the proposals would have real implications, even if you want to provide unified communications for a local council or something like that. People collecting the bins or collecting local taxes or whatever, you would still potentially be captured by the new public sector procurement rules. Plus, and this I don't think is getting discussed, telecoms networks these days are cloud-based. Whether it's a 5G core network, whether it's a virtualized BNG in the fixed network, whether it's the OSS and BSS stack, all that's cloudified. And presumably that means that if you're an operator offering any services to public sector in the EU, part of your stack is cloud-based, and some of that will be based on technology or companies that are not EU-based. Whether that's for the core network, whether that's the support desk for your radio network or whatever. Well, are you seeing anything like that, Benoit? Because to me that's underexplored.
Well, I agree with you. Now, in my mind, it ties with something that I found quite interesting, also quite contentious. France, as you may or may not know, for a number of years now, has had a rule saying that any cloud service provided to public entities has to be at least 50% owned by I don't know if it's a French or a European company. I think it's European because they wouldn't be allowed to have national preference. So, for example, I know of a number of joint offers between Thales and various US companies to offer what they call sovereign cloud. Now, I haven't looked in detail at what those contracts look like, etc. But I think initially this was primarily a way to circumvent the kind of US extraterritoriality on data. But I'm wondering if potentially there isn't a thread there as well, for maybe one of the large telcos to actually take a leading role in saying, well, we need to have a similar cloud approach across Europe and, take a strong position in the cloud services provided to telcos in order to avoid that. Now, I'm not a legal guy in any way, shape, or form, so I don't know how far that would go. I know that France has been pushing to make this a European rule, and until recently, there was a lot of pushback. But I am wondering, in fact, it ties in with something I've been thinking about ever since Trump came to power, and Trump 2 came to power, and started kind of antagonizing Europe in a much more forceful way than even during Trump 1. And one of the things I wondered about is, is there a breaking point where these big US tech companies start thinking we need to be less associated with the US? We need to be seen as, global companies that have capital from all around the world rather than being owned by US interests. Well, I don't know, but it might make sense for some of them to actually consider this as geopolitics become more and more of a factor in the equation.
I think geopolitics is a huge factor here, but at the same time, I think there's double-edged swords for everyone. So I think, we're recording this on the day that supposedly, Trump is about to announce his investments in AI companies, probably pre-IPO. We've got the OpenAI and Anthropic IPOs scheduled for the next few weeks. So, if anything, the US government it's already taken stakes in Intel and a number of others. So, there's increasing difficulty to decouple, and you see European technology companies increasing their US operations to avoid the risk of sanctions. In Europe, I think there's a double-edged sword for the operators. I think the operators and the cloud companies in Europe, the local, sort of cloud and hosting providers, see a big opportunity for offering sovereign services, but at the same time, they themselves are dependent on non-sovereign capabilities and ingredients in not just in their network but in their IT stack, which can't be replaced. And I know there's things like there's Project Silver with Silver with a Y, which is this sort of open source telco cloud initiative, which would have a high sort of European content. But you can't just rip and replace existing cloud native core networks that are still being deployed for 5G, or your OSS BSS stack. You can't just switch it over to a sovereign alternative next Wednesday. That's a multi-year, perhaps even sometimes decades-long project. If you look at the huge transformation challenges that even existing cloud moves take, if you then say, well, go back to the drawing board again and add sovereignty, that's basically takes out multiple years of development. So it has to be, whatever it is, it has to be done in progression. And I think that the executives of the operators and suppliers need to balance their desire for sort of external opportunity in selling cloud services and sovereign data centers with the looking internally and go, well, how much does this actually hurt us at the same time?
Yeah. And to be honest, I don't even think they have seen that angle at all. Or if they have, they've been keeping very quiet about it.
This is why I've been talking so much recently at events about Telecom Sovereignty. as distinct from tech sovereignty or cloud sovereignty. I think that the telecoms industry, whether it's in Europe or globally, needs to band together to say, look, these are the touch points of the sovereignty debate for the network, for telecom services, for our own IT and cloud stack, and other dependencies on supply chain. And I think that there's a real tension as well between the approach in Europe, which is very much about strategic autonomy for cloud and data residency and AI and chips. And what I see more in Canada and the US, which is more about more security and resilience first, where to some extent it's like we don't really mind where the thing you're buying is from, as long as it passes these certifications. We've got these test labs. There might be exceptions for Chinese or Russian vendors, but there's high risk. But we recognize that there's a bunch of this stuff that's going to come from the US or Taiwan or Japan or wherever. And I think that whether Europe can balance the sort of the drive for strategic autonomy with the near-term requirement for resilience and security is an important one.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then, the flip side of that is if you take the citizen's view. So just to give you an example, again, from France, there's a report that was released last week by the French Parliament on the use of AI in parliamentary work. And it turns out that self-declared, so it might even be understated, but self-declared, there's 30 to 40% of parliamentaries basically put every amendment through an AI engine, and all of these, not all of these, but massively, this is US AI engines, and so I mean, this is not even about extraterritoriality, because basically the minute you push this into an AI model, it becomes data they can use for whatever they want, and it raises huge kind of, this is the heart of government in theory. And so, I mean, obviously, as a citizen, right, there's one part of this is the kind of short-sightedness and callousness of politicians who are just going, oh, here's a shiny new tool, let's not think about it for a second and just use it. But also, more generally, it raises really important questions about how secure the political process is from at least some sort of prying, if not interference, because obviously AI is also a recommendation engine. So
and that this is before we get into the last month or two's hot topic of agentic AI and intent based, and leaving your personal agents to get on with whatever it is that they were doing. And it's whether it's your personal agent optimizing your personal workflow, or it's an agentic AI system inside an operator or a public sector organization that's doing stuff based on intent. And you get into a whole new realm of guardrails and all the rest of it. Some of which is outside of my direct focus, but I'm increasingly aware that the sort of agentic orchestration and do you know where your agents are and what they're doing is another emergent question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so long story short, this is not the last time we're talking about sovereignty.
No. But again, I'll reiterate: we really need to have previously warring factions of the telecoms industry. So that might mean Connect Europe and the Competitive Telecoms Association and the tower companies and the MVNOs and the CPaaS players and the MSPs all getting together and going, hey, telecom sovereignty is important for all of us. We know that the politicians are focused on hyperscale cloud and AI and data centers and energy and power and water and absolutely defense and everything else. But let's at least have a framework which doesn't add in telecoms as an afterthought, because at the moment it very much is.
No, I absolutely agree with you.
Great. So flipping over to you, what have you been up to?
So I've not been traveling at all, believe it or not. It's the first time in ages I've been at home for at least a month. But I have done quite a bit of exploratory work and collaborations on the intersection of policy and real life data, let's call it that. So a couple of weeks back, I participated in a panel that was organized by Ookla, where they showed some of their latest findings, and asked me to comment on some of these. Essentially, this was focused on fixed, and it was about basically three topics. The first one was how, despite adoption of fiber, there are wild differences in actual quality of experience in different markets because of all the other parts of that chain that are wildly different, and in particular, adoption of latest Wi-Fi protocols makes a massive difference to the end user quality of experience. The second one, which I think is to me the most interesting one, was looking at how, despite, again, being on fiber, distance from the nearest IXs or the nearest content servers actually had a huge impact on latency. So looking at, other types of discrimination that are not based on your access technology, but actually on like physical geography and stuff like that. And then the third one was on satellite, which is in and of itself a really interesting topic. But if I can come back to the second one for a second, what I find fascinating is that to me, that's an absolute blind spot of policy. In other words, I don't know of any policy in Europe where a regulator would look into where internet exchange points are and how closely that maps to the national geography. But now we have measurable elements that show that it has an impact on quality of experience. So to put it another way, speeds are similar, but latency is wildly degraded if you're far away from an ISP. Now, who does this affect right now? Probably gamers and a few kind of power users. But down the line, particularly if we say, as the EU has, that latency is an important metric in terms of delivering future applications, then this is something that people are going to have to look into.
And this is what annoys me about this whole discussion about edge, which we've had for the last decade at least, and is coming back again with physical AI and edge inferencing for AI, is actually its edge interconnect is at least as important as edge compute. And that everyone's so busy to say, we want to put GPUs at the cell site or in the local exchange or whatever. Well, actually, you want to have a much denser grid of interconnections, whether it's a traditional peering point or some other forms of transit, or even between mobile operators where they've got dedicated interconnect networks. But as we move, whether it's towards agentic AI or even just workloads which are chatty, where you've got at the moment a lot of requests going out to the rest of the web, you've got content delivery networks, even also things like checking for cybersecurity risks. You need to have access to everything else. And instead, we're still focused on this idea of, can we have workloads running as close to the user as possible in the network edge? Well, that's fine for things that you can put wholly at that local location. But most of what we do, what we're doing now, is with this call, is cloud plus interconnects in various ways. And that's such a blind spot. I agree.
And also, you can kind of flip that around, right? There's a reason that these IXPs are not there very locally. Is that there's a scale issue in making it work financially, right? And so the thing that has always puzzled me about, edge, whatever we want to call it, is that, where's the actual economic equation, right? It's not a matter of, having some space and putting a data center in there. And it's a matter of, is that actually going to be profitable to anyone? And this is where, again, and it's a tricky question for policymakers, because as always, we know that there is a digital divide, and it's a legitimate goal of policy to try and minimize that. Or, I mean, I don't think it'll be fully eliminated ever, but it's legitimate to do that, but it requires money to come from somewhere, and at some point, the state cannot fund everything. So I think it's a really interesting topic because, and this is where having access to kind of real life data measurements is really useful, because you can see how big the problem is and then decide whether that's an acceptable problem to have or not, and in which circumstances you should intervene, as opposed to some kind of blanket policy just on the principle of differences existing.
Yeah, and I think that there's a number of initiatives, and you mentioned, Ookla, OpenSignal, and crowdsourcing, but there's a number of other initiatives around improving data collection and metrics and KPIs. And I see that, I remember being at a session in Fuse last year, the sort of open source telecom infrastructure project, talking about quality of experience metrics and how we can get them, what QoE means. And I think that's a really important area of focus. Yeah. And I think the problem is that it's in tension with some of the other policy angles about competition, about sovereignty, actually. I mean, neither of the companies you just mentioned are European based, and so presumably they've got to process their data locally. Is there a European one? I don't know. And so
that's a good question, actually. So, it's interesting, and so I've been talking to OpenSignal a lot lately as well, and I'm sure you've seen that Ofcom last week released a new position paper on quality of experience for mobile. Yes. And that's based on OpenSignal's measurement philosophy, I guess, kind of not just the numbers, but actually the kind of approach as well, which I think is quite interesting to see a regulator very openly saying, okay, this is something we have to outsource, and we have to outsource it to people who know what they're doing. But one of the things that struck me, and I think we'll probably have more time to discuss this once it moves to the next step and we get some feedback from operators and other people in the industry. But one of the things that struck me is how small the speeds are that are considered what OpenSignal calls excellent consistent quality. So we're talking 5 megabits per second download speeds on mobile, and I think it's 1.5 up. And this is so far removed from the headline speeds that I think it also prompts a question as to whether policy in general, and I'm particularly thinking about the European Union when I say this, should be more focused on, kind of metrics that are relevant to user experience rather than headline speeds that actually say very little apart from the technical capability of the network technology. And it struck me as I was skimming through this Ofcom document that, the what's currently in the DNA and in the Europe targets, which are not specifically in the DNA, but there's a tie-in between the two, the digital decade stuff, is actually very superficial and very artificial. It doesn't relate very well to real-world experiences. I
talk about we need to have a focus on good metrics, not easy metrics. And too often we focus on the stats which we can get out the back of the network. There's a nice, easy reporting dashboard, but that's not good enough. And frankly, with crowdsourcing and also even AI estimation of some of this, we ought to get better to the numbers which mean things.
I think it's actually worse than that, because it's also the lowest common denominator of 27 countries that talk to their own telcos and what the telcos tell them they can get. So not only are we, getting the easiest metrics out of the networks, but we're also getting the easiest metrics out of the least kind of modern networks. And
And there's pushback. There's pushback from the operators saying, "Oh, it's a burden to collect the data." I'm sorry, but you've all got nice, shiny new AI systems that you keep talking about. You ought to be able to have a nice interface that goes into all your now collated data, saying, "Give me the answer to these questions." That
Yeah,
should be getting easier based
no,
on what we know of automation and AI.
yeah, and if there's one thing where we know AI functions relatively well, it's collecting data and not having to interpret it in any way, just showing it in a way that is relevant to whoever wants to see it. No, I agree with you. I agree with you. So I think that's another, for me, it's another kind of long-term line of thought is, this intersection of metric collection and policy, and basically how does it allow us to answer some of either the blind spots or the questions that have been very hard to answer until now, and how do we slice the data in a way that allows us to have some insight as to how this could be addressed from a policy point of view. I think that's a really, really interesting question.
I mean, I agree, and the thing I'm going to do a review of the Ofcom. It's called Connectivity You Can Count On. I've got a half-written review that I put on my Substack, but they break it down between dense urban areas, rural areas, indoors, and on trains. UK has a particular problem with train connectivity, and I'm a big
with trains in general, I would say.
I mean, indoor wireless is long been a preoccupation of mine. In fact, I'm running a workshop on indoor wireless, which will cover some of these on July 16th. So, quick plug for that and early bird tickets. Look at my LinkedIn and I'll show in the show notes. But a key thing here for indoor is actually you can start to both measure it with crowdsourcing much better than the traditional drive tests, which are outdoor coverage. And there are new technologies available to enhance quality experience for indoors, whether that's neutral host in public settings, which are going to offer better design and capability where the building owner potentially pays for that because they're mandated to do it, or because they need to offer good services to their visitors or employees or tenants. And so I think that there's definitely a role for QoE monitoring and measurement, but it has to be in context, not this sort of nationwide aggregates or overall we do this number of petabytes a month. That's no use. We want to have speeds.
Well, it's very limited use anyway. Yes. Yeah. No, I agree with you. And by the way, do you think that HS2 is going to put as much money into getting good connectivity as they put into getting bats across the hills, or?
That's whether it's frankly, I mean, is actually HS2 is the least of the problems. Is normal sort of long distance trains and commuter trains and tunnels. But I suspect commuter trains is a big issue. There's a whole. I wrote something about the train connectivity. It's one of those things that takes forever. UK actually the government has actually got a policy now. They're going to be part funding putting. I'm not sure if it's specifically Starlink, but satellite backhaul for better on-train Wi-Fi. And there's this debate about should you have Wi-Fi on trains or should you just use cellular either through the windows or with the repeaters. And I think you need both. And so having Starlink collected Wi-Fi on trains would be fantastic. I've been on a few aircraft recently with fast satellite connectivity, and it's you can actually do proper work rather than the old sort of maybe if you're over the right part of the ocean in the right place. So if that's replicated on trains, that'd be a very good thing.
I agree.
All right. So
what are your plans? Like very quickly, what are your plans for the coming few weeks?
Right. This week I'm heading to Lisbon for Amplify, which is the sort of network as a service industry association. I'm in Brussels next week for a Spectrum event and also something about D2D satellite policy. And then I'll be at the TM Forum DTW in Copenhagen. And then, as I mentioned, on July 16th, I've got my own indoor wireless workshop in London. Yourself?
I don't have a lot of traveling planned, but I think one of the big topics in the coming few weeks is that the kind of network fees debate is rearing its ugly head in non-European geographies. And so I'm going to be focused, I think, a lot on, I guess, kind of educating other policy people on the generally bad ideas
Yeah.
in this space. But it is tricky because clearly, the European stance has emboldened a lot of telcos around the world to say, "Hey, this is a new source for revenue for us. We should fight for this."
Yeah, and I know GSMA and Connect Europe and others are sort of going around the world extolling it. I've heard things from India and I think bits of LATAM and Africa on that. So yeah, so one level it's the usage charging, and the other hot topic, which maybe come back to another one, is lots of operators, especially in the US and bits of developed Asia, talking about token charging and can we sell AI
Yeah,
tokens, which that's a discussion for another day, I think.
yeah. All right. Well,
Excellent.
that was another good one.
Yeah.
And I'll speak to you. Well, I'm sure I'll speak to you before a month, but in public, I'll speak to you in a month.
Excellent. And to everyone else, please like and subscribe and reach out to either of us, whether if you want got further questions or you want us to come and talk to you about things. Thank you.
Bye bye.